Hello, I am back after a week away. Thanks for waiting for me. Joining me on the conversation today, Dr. Eddie Glaude of Princeton University, talking about his new book about James Baldwin. That interview begins about 15 and a half minutes after I blather on for a while. Then Professor Eric Segall joins me to talk about the last Supreme Court decisions and the term as a whole. He has talked and written a new article about the winners and losers of the Supreme Court term. That interview begins at about 1 hour and 4 minutes. I am Pete Dominic. It's time to stand up with me right now. Hello, friends, and it's good to be talking to you again. I want to be talking with you this week. The question I have for you is, where does coronavirus end? How does coronavirus end? You can email me, standupwithpete@gmail.com, and give me some of your thoughts. Send me your phone number, and I'll try to give you a call, which we can tape and air on this podcast. Thank you so much for pressing play and subscribing to the podcast wherever or however you do. I hope you'll consider a paid subscription, seeing as I get the best experts and the most interesting guests every day of the week. Thank you to all the folks who are already on board, making this podcast bigger and more sustainable every day. And thank you to everyone who insisted that I take a week off for a little vacation. But I do hope next time I will be able to pre-tape the entire week's worth of shows so I can post episodes for you to listen to, because I did hear from lots of people who said they were missing the show, the conversation, even though they were glad I was taking some much-needed R&R, and oh, did I need it. You know, someone told me when the vacation was over, I was talking with someone a couple days ago, and I guess Friday, and she said, you really need 2 weeks because you need 1 week just to figure out what you're doing and to refocus your mind on trying to relax. And then if you're in a new place, where are the best places to go to do the things that you like to do and enjoy, to eat, etc., and so on. But it was obviously a privilege to get away. There's a good, healthy, robust debate whether or not we should even be getting in our cars and traveling to places. And I think those are fair discussions to be having. Some states have quarantines and some do not. I'm actually not even sure if Massachusetts had a quarantine. We went to Nantucket. Did we break the law? Don't tell anybody. And we stayed with our friend, Donna Barnett. If you know anybody who wants to buy or rent a home in Nantucket, contact Donna Barnett or I will for you. I did my best to step the screen and try to connect with nature and my family, but I couldn't tear myself from the news every day. I didn't spend a lot of time watching the news. I've seen all the videos of crazy white people not wearing masks or just being like really racist and fighting, the lady pointing her gun at these two women. And some giant white guy goes after this black woman and takes a shot at her. And then this other young black dude comes in and kicks the crap out of the big old white racist guy. Actually, I don't know if he was racist. He was just a horrible person for taking a swing at a woman and he got his ass kicked for it. Those videos, I watched them all. I cannot tear myself away from these horrible videos of horrible humans doing horrible things. I am not proud of myself. Do you watch those? Of all the very divisive issues and ideas in our giant diverse nation, the fact that the wearing of masks is tearing apart our society has to say something really important about what our society even is. Speaking of the plague, by the way, seems to be getting a lot worse. New records being broken every day. And, of course, if coronavirus wasn't out of control in several states, then we'd only be focused on the president's corruption, and the top story of the front page of every newspaper, at the top of every newscast, would be that on Friday night, President Trump commuted Roger Stone's sentence. Roger Stone, a guy who he's been friendly with for a long time, who is, of course, still a convicted felon, But that's not it, because, of course, coronavirus is raging in the country right now. The U.S. has lost over 130,000 Americans of our citizens. It looks like this week there's going to be a lot more debate about going back to school. Some states are set to start school next month. You crazy people who start school in August, I think Texas and Indiana, those states where it's a lot hotter, I guess. What's the reason that you guys start early? Anyway, the debate over sending kids back to school and for how long is going to be a big topic this week. Betsy DeVos was a disaster on TV on both CNN and Fox News over the weekend. My friend Randy Weingarten of the American Federation of Teachers has been great. I'll try to invite her back on the podcast this week. But as Florida, Texas, Arizona now bringing the country's coronavirus cases to 70,000 per day. And it's just wreaking havoc on our country in those states, especially. I mean, I live in New York. We already had our hardest time, although, I mean, what's to say it's not coming back? That's why my question at the very beginning is one I'd really like to hear what you think. How does this end? Where? When does this end? Oh, the president finally wore a mask while visiting wounded warriors at Walter Reed. I like him in a mask because can't see half his face. So to me, that's awesome. I mean, I think to anybody, most decent people looking at Trump's face is hard. So if half of it's covered, then great. More than 15,000 new cases of coronavirus were reported in Florida Saturday, the highest single-day total for any state during the duration of the coronavirus pandemic. Congratulations, Florida. And by the way, apparently Disney World in Orlando, where I did my college internship at Epcot Center, reopened on the same day that Florida set a national record. I mean, and it was already a horrific week. And now everybody is calling the Magic Kingdom the Tragic Kingdom. Hilarious. So, crazy what's happening right now. And if you're like me, you are having a hard time looking away from it. And I think that's most people. Every day, I think, is it got to be a gift. Every day is a gift. That's how I'm looking at it. That's how my wife told me to look at it. Shit is so scary and crazy and mostly uncertain that every day is a gift. So do the best you can with each day. Try to make good meals. Try to get good rest. Try to manage your stress and anxiety as best you can. And we're all dealing with that. And I want to hear from you as to how you're dealing with it. Some of us are dealing with it better than others. Some days are better than others. I hear that a lot. In Texas, a lot of hospitals are nearing capacity, and the governor there, Greg Abbott, who is a disaster, is admitting that things are going to get worse in the coming week. And shout out to my friend Addison, who is an emergency room physician in West Texas, thinking about him every day. Reach out to him every day. So, lots to talk about in terms of the Roger Stone commutation and the president's corruption. I think the most important thing to say about that, and I'm not going to say much about it because I want to get to my conversations, but say what you will about Trump and his open corruption. Just this thing with Roger Stone, the idea that he has also had his attorney general, his king's hand, as I've heard my friend Joy Reid call him. He's had him remove the top 3 prosecutors investigating Trump in D.C. and New York Southern Eastern districts. All these prosecutors were looking into Trump crimes, and now all these 3 prosecutors are gone. And then, of course, the Roger Stone commutation, as well as others. You know, the only guy who's doing time is the guy who flipped on him, Michael Cohen, who's back in jail because he went out to dinner like a jackass. Jackass. Horrible. So it's the Republicans that are supporting Trump. I think that's the big point. Forget Trump. All these Republicans are going along with him. they're the ones I think that are more of a disgrace and should carry more guilt, and their names should be tarnished for history for going along with this crazy person. And finally, I did want to mention that I've heard from more than a few people a conspiracy that the store, the online retailer Wayfair, is selling children. Have you heard about this one? I have a theory. What do you think about this theory? That there are people who believe that there is a global pedophile ring being covered up by Democrats and the mainstream media, whatever the narrative is. And then there's the rest of us. There are two, it's not liberal and conservative. It's not pro or anti-Trump. It's these people, most of the Trump supporters, this is my theory, most believe in the craziest conspiracies that you can possibly make up. Is Wayfair trafficking children via overpriced items? That's the claim. That Wayfair is trafficking children based entirely on one person's confusion over an expensive cabinet and shower curtain. And the way that these theories devolve and these dots are connected is just, it's bizarre. And it's so dangerous. And we're seeing it far too much, and it's spreading throughout the country. This mentality, this crazy idea about these pedophile rings. I mean, you must know someone who believes this stuff or is posting about this stuff. Anyway, I've got two great guests. Anyway, how am I going to wrap up that whole 11-minute rant? If you listen to it, I appreciate it. I'd love to know your thoughts on my question. I'd love to reach out to you and talk to you about it. Again, how does coronavirus end? Where does it end? When does it end? Email me, standupwithpete@gmail.com. Okay. Would love to hear from you, Nat. And again, if you haven't gotten a paid subscription, I'd love for you to sign up. Go to patreon.com/Pete Dominic or click on the paid subscription link in the show notes. Every day there are show notes. I'd love to have you join the Patreon community. Over 600 people. We need to get to like 3,000 for the podcast to be sustainable. And it's growing, and I'm feeling really good about that. And I'm now making my first major investment in the podcast, which I wish were a person or two to work with me. And I hope that's the case. And if we get to the 3,000 number, I think it could be. But I'm building a new studio. As you might have heard my saga, I got baked along with my equipment temporarily while I was supposed to be doing a Facebook Live moderating a conversation about being a white ally. And all my equipment broke, at least temporarily. So I got to get out of the garage, the corner of my garage where there's no daylight, and I'm moving into the shed where I'm going to have giant windows looking out on my garden, talking to you. That's my dream. That's literally my dream. It is so attainable to be able to do the show every day, log as many hours as I can, talking to as many smart people as well as you, hearing from you, connecting with you, and sitting in front of nature, specifically my garden. That's the dream. So Eddie Glaude is my first guest. Dr. Eddie Glaude is a professor at Princeton University. He's a fascinating guy. He is such an intelligent, thoughtful, passionate, vulnerable, classy, funny guy. I love Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr. I'd talk to him each and every day, if I could, each week at least. You know, you watch all these cable news shows and they have the same people joining them day in and day out, a lot of the same people. And I have a lot of the same people joining me, but I have a lot more people, I think. And when I think about who I could talk to or would love to talk to every week, he's right up there. But, you know, he's a Princeton professor. He's got other things to do. But whenever I can rope him into joining me on the conversation, I do. He is a real special guy, and his new book is great. It's called Begin Again, James Baldwin's America, and it's urgent lessons for our own. And he is a professor at Princeton University. He is on Twitter at ES Glaude. And someday I hope to be in his class. But in lieu of sitting in his class at Princeton, I don't know how that could ever happen. But, I could go and visit campus and audit a class and then buy him a coffee, talk about everything after. That's another little dream. How about that one? I can make that happen, can't I? These are attainable dreams. Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr., Princeton University, his new book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America, and its urgent lessons for our own. Get it now. Good to be back, everybody. Here's our conversation right now. There he is. Very excited to have him back on the podcast. One of my all-time favorite conversations and people to read and talk to and watch in conversation with other people. Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr., welcome back to Stand Up. Congratulations on your new book. Thanks for joining me.
Man, it's a pleasure, Peter, just to have a chance to dialogue with you and then to lay eyes on you, man. I appreciate it.
I appreciate that a lot. How do you explain how perfect your Windsor knot is on your neckties? We see you on MSNBC all the time. We see those ties. Where did you learn the art of that knot, and do you realize how perfect it is?
It is Morehouse College that educated me in this practice, and it's my obsessive compulsive behavior with perfect knots.
So the first time we spoke, you mentioned, or maybe I did, ask about Morehouse, and I guess I didn't realize, very ignorant to, historically black colleges and universities in America and their traditions and so on. But then I read Bakari Seller's book, and he talks a lot about how going to Morehouse changed him. And I just wanted to ask you about that since you brought it up. How did that college, that experience, change you as a man?
Oh my goodness, it is difficult to put in words. I was a country boy from Mississippi with a lot of confidence, but with no polish, just raw coal, and going to Morehouse and being put in that pressure, right? And it was just amazing. And what's the most important about that experience, Pete, is I met my closest friends, people who I still hang out with. I met when I was 16 years old. And they are, so Morehouse created the conditions for me to meet people who are cornerstones in my life. And then gave me a sense of
You're getting a call.
Yeah, gave me a sense of how important being committed to a just world, a racially just world, actually is. It's always a beautiful experience, man. Sorry about the phone.
No worries at all. You're in high demand because you have a brand new book out, which is excellent, which is getting amazing reviews, and which I'm very excited to talk with you about. And there's so much. It's really hard to figure out where to begin with Begin Again, James Baldwin's America, and its urgent lessons for our own. But I got to ask you where you did begin on this project, why you wanted to search through James Baldwin's life and as closely as you could follow in his literal footsteps, go to the places that he went to and lived in and spoke at. Why?
I've been thinking about and teaching about James Baldwin for over 30 years, reading him closely. It took a minute for me to decide to read him.
Yeah, you were late to Baldwin.
Yeah, I didn't come to him till graduate school, and I was afraid to come to him because I knew what he would do. Right? I knew he would mess me up.
Yeah,
he would throw me back onto myself, and I would have to deal with the vulnerable little boy that I am, and deal with my daddy issues and all of this. I knew that would happen, so I had to kind of keep him at arm's length for a minute because I didn't have the resources to do that kind of work. But there's something about the way in which Baldwin came to terms with the country's betrayal after the assassination of Dr. King. And as he saw all of those idealistic young people express their rage and disappointment and disillusionment with Black Power in the context of Black Power, Baldwin had to figure out how to pick up the pieces. And I was like, let me turn to Baldwin in this period of his life, because I think I'm in a similar moment now. where despair and disillusionment threatened to overwhelm. How did he handle it? What resources did he draw on that could be useful for me in this time? And that was the foundation for the book.
Yeah, very personal journey and really vulnerable of you to write it the way that you wrote it. I think you've always been, it would seem, honest and vulnerable, but you seem to become more vulnerable the older you get and the more work you put out. Talk a little bit about, because you said, for me, in this moment, of course, you are not alone. There are so many other people that are experiencing this growth and these emotions and confronting all of these issues of history and our present time along with you. But you tell your journey in here. Talk a little bit about what that specifically is for you. There's the excitement around 2008 and the election of the first Black president, right? And I had been working with Tavis Smiley before then and Cornel West with the Covenant with Black America, where we were going around the country holding town hall meetings, trying to get Black folk to address these specific issues concerning our communities. And then the phenomenon of Obama hit us. And everyone got excited. Organizers began to focus their energies on Obama. And then he got into office, and I was so disappointed in so many ways because, the Great Recession devastated Black communities. And Obama was kind of having to protect his left flank, his right flank. So he was cautious. And then, all of these police murders and of Black folk with Mike Brown, Aiyana Jones. I mean, we get Eric Garner, And then we saw voter ID laws and voter suppression. And we were seeing the vitriol of the Tea Party, this backlash, which I hate that word, but this detritus of American society beginning to evidence itself. And then the country vomited up Donald Trump. Yeah. And as a result, a lot of scholars say that it was that word backlash. It was a reaction to Obama.
Yeah.
That doesn't, there's no way, you don't see any way around that. That's kind of the conventional wisdom, and you're not a conventional wisdom guy, but you don't see any way around Trump being a reaction to Obama.
Not at all. The Tea Party was not motivated by economic anxiety.
The Tea Party was a reaction to Obama.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we saw the AstroTurf protests around Obamacare and the like. We knew what was going on. We were screaming it from the top of our lungs as we were trying to push Obama to the left and not have a Black version of Clinton centrist democratic governance, as it were. So when the country elected Donald Trump and everything became about him, it's like we're trapped in this, chamber where he wants to occupy our passions at all times. And so, and because I'm a pundit, even though I'm a professor, I'm in this chamber every single day of every minute of the day, it seems. And it's just driving me, freaking mad. I was going to say another F word.
You can say it on there, but yeah.
It's driving me. It was driving me mad, right? And then I was seeing all of these MAGA hats and all of this, and I was trying to make sense of it, and just despairing and disillusioned because of my own political choices at the time and a range of other things. And so I just left the chaos of Donald Trump and ran into the storm of Jimmy Baldwin's life.
I think about the Tea Party. I think their rallying cry was, and they really became popular and influential, I think, in around 2010. Their rallying cry was "Take Back America." That's what we heard so often. Of course, Trump is "Make America Great Again," but they both seem to make this sound like the same thing to me. What does it sound like to you?
It's a nostalgic desire for America where Black folk knew their place, where women were in the home, where Latino folks cut lawn.
Religion?
Yes, exactly. It's Christian, particularly white evangelical Christian. It's a longing for an idealized version of the 1950s. That's what it is. They want a white America in the vein of old Europe, or old America.
And they're also longing for a version of America that never existed, even probably for white people. Forget about minorities for a second. I mean, it wasn't there even necessarily for white people, or, the policies that they think were in place never were in place. I mean, the tax rate, for example.
Yeah, I think it's a caricature of the worst elements of Reaganism. You see, and I think that's really important, because what people try to do is draw the line from Donald Trump to Pat Buchanan to George Wallace to Strom Thurmond. And in fact, Ronald Reagan is the soil that produced Donald Trump. Ronald Reagan was the B-list Hollywood actor. He was America's fantasy. And Donald Trump is the latest B version of that version.
How dare you, sir? Come on this show. Like, this show is and criticize one of the greatest American presidents, Ronald Reagan. It's interesting as we start to reckon with our history and Confederate monuments and so on, who we will kind of allow and not defend, and obviously it seems like everybody is progressive minded, obviously, on board with taking down Confederate monuments and names and so on. Not nearly enough people. I shouldn't say everybody, but a lot of people. Joe Biden, he says, take down the Confederate monuments, but you got to leave Columbus and Washington alone, apparently yesterday. But nobody seemingly talks about Ronald Reagan. We're not ready, as James Baldwin always made us uncomfortable with things we weren't ready to hear or feel or think or believe. But we're not ready for the criticism that you just laid out on the great Ronald Reagan. How dare you?
We have to be, because right now we're in a moment where the era of Reagan is collapsing. I think the general consensus, let me say it differently. I think one of the underlying features of the current protest is that our current way of being in this country is broken, that an economic and political and social set of arrangements that they're bankrupt. And what I think it has something to do with, right, the increasing wealth divide, the precarity of everyday ordinary workers, right, this aggressive form of policing that's rooted in a framework of law and order and being tough on crime. These are elements of Reaganism. Whether you call it Reaganism, whether you call it Thatcherism, whether you call it neoliberalism, we know over the last 40 to 50 years, we have, as Anand Giridharadas says, we have been playing in an arena that was built by Ronald Reagan, which involved a small notion of a particular understanding of government, where big government is bad. Government's sole responsibility is to ensure the efficiency of the economy and the national defense. It transforms us from being citizens to individual entrepreneurs in pursuit of our own self-interest and competition and rivalry with others. It insists on lower tax rates for the producers, for the shareholders, as it flatlines the wages of everyday ordinary working people, keeping their noses barely above water so they can't organize. It exploits white resentments, hatreds, and fears in the name of crime and the like. So it leads to shall we say, the militarization of police, the expansion of the criminal code, the expansion of carceral state. All of these are features of Reaganism, right? And it's collapsing right in front of our faces. And we need to understand that for what it is. Yeah,
I think that is such an important point that does not get nearly as much discussion. I hope it gets more discussion, because when people look back, and I'm 44, so he's the first president I remember. And I think especially when white people look back at Reagan, they're like, yeah, he was pretty good. Look at his approval rate. Look at the wide margins with which he won the presidency. And they look back and all of the high points. But when black people look back at Reagan, or not necessarily Reagan, but if they're not politically astute, but that time in America, they don't see any of the things that white people tout of Reaganism. What do black people see when they look back at his 8 years and what he created? You already touched on some of it generally, but
but Peter, when Reagan was elected, Doc, they thought Reagan was, in the eyes of black activists, Reagan was as bad as George Wallace. Think about him as governor of California. The whole issue with the Black Panthers, the whole issue with Angela Davis, he was the governor. Think about the tax revolt that happened, that in some ways turned the country's back on the Great Society. That's Reagan. Reagan is handed the baton by Barry Goldwater. He's the one who brings it to the tape, right? So when Reagan was elected, there was a deep sense of hopelessness in Black America. There's a deep fear in Black America, right? In some ways, remember, people forget that George H.W. Bush ran against Ronald Reagan and described his economic philosophy as voodoo economics.
Never forget that. Never. So important.
Exactly.
Because then when he lost the primary, he changed his tune on
exactly
the most important economic theory of that time.
He saw the wind. He felt the wind, you know.
Right.
But I think it's important that Jimmy Baldwin saw this on the horizon. He saw Reagan on the horizon. He saw what white America doubling down on its ugliness. And I have a chapter in the book entitled Reckoning and a chapter entitled The Ruins. And there's a documentary he co-produces entitled I Heard It Through the Grapevine that's really about the betrayal of the civil rights movement as a kind of way of framing Reagan's election in 1980.
What do you think it is? What's more pernicious, effective, or damaging? The kind of dog whistle racism, or the more overt racism? You know, the welfare queen type of commentary, or the more overt racism that obviously came before that and is the history of this country?
Well, you know, on one level, it's important that we created a context where you had to dog whistle.
Good point. Sure, I guess.
Right? And the reason why I say that, because people died, right? If I didn't step off the sidewalk, or my colleague Albert Rabbitoe, his father dared to go to a convenience store and confront the convenience store owner for disrespecting his wife, and the convenience store owner blew his dad's brains out, right? So the reality is that, you know, the previous racial regime was policed by, you know, overt violence, right? And, you know, denying Black people dignity and standing in an overt way. So to shift the post-civil rights consensus is that you had to appeal to racism and to white resentment and hatred by way of the dog whistle. You couldn't do it explicitly. And so the Republican Party, you know, really mastered it. The DLC and Clinton copied it. Because we can't forget that Clinton, you know, remember he had that press conference about the crime bill in Stone Mountain with Black inmates behind it.
Yeah. Clinton's policies on crime, as well as his economic policies that he compromised with Republicans on destroying welfare, as we know it, are two things that we should never forget about Bill Clinton.
So the story is not just a Republican story.
No doubt about it. But I don't know if I let you finish there in terms of
sure.
which is worse. So maybe I shouldn't make it a binary. Maybe that's stupid. But I just feel I've heard a lot of Black folks, specifically, I remember this one comedian, Bruce, telling me about how he prefers your overt racism. Just be honest. That's fine with me. I won't be upset with you. Don't hide it so I have to guess as to where you stand.
Right.
Does that make any sense?
No, absolutely. So I see the gist of the question, you know, and look, the loud racist is easy. You know, this is Malcolm X's language. You know, there's the wolf and the fox, right? You know what the wolf is up to. The fox is a different thing, right? So you know, the loud racists are easy. The people who are running around with Confederate flags, screaming the N-word, doing all the things that they do.
Who don't think they're racist, by the way.
Right. But in a melodramatic context, if we were watching All My Children, that soap opera, which my mother loved, then that's the way in which the melodrama plays itself out. We can see the enemies. The evil people are, you know, are easy to identify. There's Erica, right? So, but the real problem for us in this country isn't the loud racists. The real problem is the ones who are silent and complicit with those loud racists. The ones who are content to have segregated neighborhoods because they know that their property values will be okay. The ones who are content with unequal education because they just want their kids to go to the best schools. The ones who are content with a healthcare system that is so profoundly problematic because they have, you know, limousine healthcare, right? So it's the ones who are complicit with their way of life and silent about the injustices that define our way of life, that to me are deeply, deeply troublesome, problematic even.
Begin Again is the name of the new book. And when you began to write it, obviously Trump, when did you start it?
2 years ago.
So Trump is president. It's a dark, dark time for so many of us, especially, minorities, women. But maybe there wasn't a lot of hope then. Who knows? It's different based on who you talk to. Now, though, the book comes out at a time where public opinion is rapidly changing on racial injustice. We can talk about why, but how do you see this time that we're in and the importance of this book coming out right now with, I don't know if I want to phrase it, the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, but certainly the effectiveness of the Black Lives Matter movement to really change public opinion drastically and quickly?
Well, we're at a moment, we're at an inflection point, to use Mattis's phrase, right? We're in a moment, or to think about it in the blues sense, we're at the crossroads like Robert Johnson was, right? So we have to confront, we have to make a choice, right? What kind of country will we be? And it's important, I think, for me at this moment to be talking about my journey with Baldwin because of the moral weight of the choice in front of us. In the past, we've had a chance to be otherwise. You think about radical Reconstruction. We had a really genuine attempt at a multiracial democracy.
Post-Civil War.
Stevens and all these folk were trying to go back and do their first works over. That's when the first modern U.S. nation state emerges. Our notion of citizenship really takes shape in that period with the passage of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. What did we get in response?
Jim Crow.
We got Jim Crow. We got convict leasing. We got the monuments, right, to the Confederacy. We got the lost cause. And then, so in a moment in which we could be otherwise, we doubled down on the ugliness. We'd made a bad choice. The mid-20th century, Black freedom struggle, King, Black power, however we want to describe that struggle. What did we get in response? Calls for law and order, laid the foundation for the carceral state, the tax revolt.
Assassinations,
the tax revolt, which shredded the social safety net, which turned its back on the basic contract of the New Deal. And what did we get in response? We elected Ronald Reagan. So 2 moments, even with the election of, as we laid out with the election of Barack Obama, we get Tea Party, voter ID laws, voter suppression, Donald Trump. So it's a moment in which the country has an opportunity to choose to be otherwise. But our history tells us that we aren't very good at this.
Well, we're not very good at this because it's super uncomfortable. And uncomfortable things are difficult for people, especially people who are comfortable.
Exactly.
And Baldwin makes us very uncomfortable. Made you uncomfortable to kind of confront and to read him, which is why, it wasn't until grad school. Most Americans probably still don't know who James Baldwin is, unfortunately. Most white Americans, for sure, I would imagine. But what is it about Baldwin that makes us all so uncomfortable?
Tells the truth, unvarnished, straight, no chaser, right? He's it's like Emerson thinking about America, right? You get this beautiful prose. Baldwin is thinking about America, but on the other side of the tracks, right? It's not going to be a soaring rhetoric. He's going to take you to the trash heaps that kids play in. He's going to take you to piss-stained halls in Harlem, right? So there's this, he's going to force you to see the bodies dangling from poplar trees, the contradictions that are at the heart of the country. He's going to say, you've been lying to yourself. And you've been lying to yourself because you want to be comfortable. You are invested in the illusion of safety, and that illusion is going to strangle you, right? And so he has this wonderful line. He says, I want us to do something unprecedented. I want us to create a self without the need for an enemy. You just kind of go, damn, that's serious. But in order to do that, you got to tell the truth about yourself. Right? You got to tell the truth about the country. And so Baldwin has this twinning move, Peter. He demands that you engage in the examined life. He believes with Socrates that the unexamined life isn't worth living. So you got to deal with the mess in you.
Yeah.
Because Baldwin believes that it's the messiness of our interior lives that actually evidences itself in the messiness of our social arrangements. To use the language, we're fucked up. And so we create fucked up things.
Mm.
And so we have to deal with this first. So he says, I'm not the N-word. I never have been. The question is, why did you need the N-word in the first place? And until we figure that out, why you need it, I'm going to give it back to you. I'm not the N-word, baby. You are. Mm-hmm. Now deal with that, right? So this is what he's dealing with. Yeah.
But you keep saying we. But I feel like black people know the truth. They live the truth. You don't have to be a scholar as a black person. You have to have any education. You just have to be a black skin and live in America during that time, during now, to kind of understand the truths that I think a lot of white people are starting, sadly, lately to figure out. And a lot of that has to do with cameras and just a sense of honesty. But it's not black people who had to confront the truth, is it? It's everybody else.
When I use my we, it's a moral declaration. It's an ethical stance that I'm not giving up on this effort, right? That the we that I'm invoking, right, is a sense of our collective relation to each other, right? So that's not quite the right way to put it, but our sense of relationship to each other. It's aspirational in one hand, and it's also, Peter, an announcement of my investment in this. So I could easily say, white folk have just lost their damn minds, right? That I could easily say, and I do at times say this, but when I invoke a we, I'm telling you that I'm invested in this, that I'm here, that I'm a part of it all.
I wonder if that's to some extent inaccurate. A lot of white people have obviously lost their minds in terms of, I tweeted this last night, but Republicans are now nominating and potentially electing, these QAnon conspiracy theorists who think, Democrats are lizard people and demons, literally, like I'm not joking, like they believe they're protecting pedophile rings and so on. So by that measure, I would say, a lot of white people have lost their minds to so many of these conspiracy theories and become part of a cult. But may I defend white people, if I dare say, and say we never had our minds. I remember I grew up a certain way. I was educated a certain way. I had this specific experience. It was sheltered. It was mainly homogenous. Thankfully, my mom worked as a public school teacher in the city of Syracuse, and we had exposure to other cultures a little bit in our family. But my point is, it wasn't until I read Howard Zinn that I came to the people's history that I was like, oh my gosh, we are fucked up, and started to learn these truths that were so uncomfortable to learn about the history of America and the group that technically I belonged to because of the color of my skin. My point is, I feel like so many white people especially just never learned it because we were never taught it, and it was easy because we're so segregated. Yeah,
and then there's willful ignorance, because you knew the side of the tracks, you knew the side of the town, you knew what was happening over in a certain sector of Syracuse. You knew. I mean, so Jimmy says this in The Fire Next Time, right? There's a kind of innocence about what is happening to folk in the country, and the innocence is the crime, right? But I want to say this to you. I want to make a distinction that Jimmy makes in The Evidence of Things Not Seen, his last book about the Atlanta child murders. He makes a distinction between white people and people who happen to be white. White people is a political and ethical, moral position where there's an investment in one's identity as white, and then there are people who happen to be white. And that what I mean by that are those folks who are engaged in the ongoing work of interrogating, right, how whiteness works in their lives, how racism, right, comes to them as easy as language, right? This is what Wendell Berry, the Kentucky-born writer, wrote in his wonderful little book, The Hidden Wound, right? So there's this sense in which there's this ongoing work of understanding how race overdetermines the distribution of advantage and disadvantage. So when I say white people, I'm talking at a certain level of generality about people who are invested in a particular kind of identity. Because I happen to love a lot of people who happen to be white, and then they're white people, right?
Well said. Yeah, no, that's the nuance that I love about talking to you and reading you, and the nuance that I miss when you're on TV, because every time you're done talking, I'm like, no, let him talk more. Shut up. More Eddie. One of the personal experiences that I had in college, and then one of the, I think, things I learned from watching If Beale Street Could Talk, directed by Barry Jenkins. Of course, the book, it's a movie based on a book by James Baldwin. I learned Black love. And what I mean by that is I had never witnessed Black love intimately. I hadn't seen it. In college, I witnessed it because I became very close with a lot of Black guys. And I remember sitting one night outside the library where my friend was crying because he was worried about his mom, who was ill. And he talked about how close he was with his mom. And that was a really important moment for me. And watching If Beale Street Could Talk showed me a different kind of Black love, romantic Black love. And I wonder if being exposed to that changed my views that I had somehow maybe ignorantly and without an understanding formulated. And that to me is kind of like what Black Lives Matter is. It's like what so much of your work is showing all of us that we aren't different. But white people believe that we are so often. We don't value Black lives. And I think it's partially because we don't understand Black love is the exact same as our love, whether it be familiar or romantic. Did I say anything that made sense that you could jump out of in terms of Baldwin's work?
Sure. I think at the heart of the American project is this contradiction that was wrapped around the legs of the table upon which the Declaration of Independence was signed. And it is this belief that white people matter more than others, that they are valued more than others, that the color of one's skin determines one's capacity and character. And they had to say this. Baldwin has this wonderful line. I write this in the book. He has this wonderful line where he talks about the lie. It's a fascinating moment, and it's at the heart of something that I was trying to work through in the book. He says, the people who settled the country had a fatal flaw. They could recognize a man when they saw one. They knew he wasn't anything else but a man. But since they were Christian, and since they had already decided that they came here to establish a free country, the only way to justify the role this chattel was playing in one's life was to say that he was not a man. For if he wasn't, then no crime had been committed.
Right.
That lie is the basis of our present trouble. So there's a moment of dehumanization, of justifying using Black bodies as a source of capital accumulation. And the discourse around that, think about it, Peter. Black women's wombs were sites of profit, right? And so
that just got me. Whoa, never heard that. Yeah. Never heard it quite put like that, man.
And so what happens to a country predicated upon a system that exploits the labor of these folk, knowing that they're human beings, because at the cover of night, they're going into the slave quarters and engaging in all sorts of heinous acts, right? Knowing that they're human beings, but yet treating them as if they're chattel, right? So that lie is at the heart of it all, you see? That devaluation is at the heart of it all. And every instance in which we try to change the course of things, there's a reassertion that white people are valued more than others. That's at the heart of it all, that lie.
Yeah, and never heard that. That would actually really affected me, the way that you phrased that. And I just watched that film, Harriet, and about Harriet Tubman, and watching the depictions of people's relationships and people's families being torn apart. I think what you just said is also I try to boil things down so I can understand them, but there was hundreds of years, centuries of dehumanization, of work, real work, to convince people that Black bodies were not as human as white bodies. Black lives are not as human as what your work has been dedicated to, and of course what James Baldwin's work is dedicated to, was a harsh reality of introduction of humanization, of reversing hundreds of years of beliefs of dehumanization. You are humanizing, and what you are combating what we have learned and what we have somehow, for some reason, accepted in our nation and in our culture of dehumanization. That's what it is. It's what it is every day.
And the thing that the critical point is that you cannot tell me that if you have been engaged in over 400 plus years of dehumanizing someone, that you haven't been dehumanized yourself. That what you're trying to do to me actually distorts and disfigures your soul.
How so?
Because you can't engage in such monstrous acts and not become a monster yourself. What does it mean that you can literally sell your child? You know that that's your child, and you still put them on the auction block. What does it mean that you know that you would not kill a white drunk kid who's parked his car outside of a Wendy's? You know you wouldn't shoot him in the back because you've never done it. What does it mean? What does it say about you that you would shoot him in the back, right? That you would kill him in cold blood and then kick him when you get to him? That isn't about Rashard Brooks. That isn't about the child. That's about you. So what Baldwin is saying, the person in the moment you debase, you end up debasing yourself, right? And Santayana would put it, the philosopher put it this way. He says, people who aren't, and I'm paraphrasing, people who aren't aware of their history are doomed to repeat it.
Yeah.
But what he forgot to say is that people who aren't aware of their history, who are blind, not only are they doomed to forget it, but they often become They become monstrous. Right? So this is what I'm suggesting here.
Yeah. Is there a way to describe and talk about the importance of James Baldwin's fiction versus his nonfiction?
Yeah, I love Jimmy's fiction, but I'm not a big interpreter of his literary writings, his novels. Let me put it that way. Giovanni's Room was just simply was amazing. He drops. Think about this, Peter. He writes "Go Tell It on the Mountain," Notes of a Native Son, emerges as this extraordinary figure, interpreter of American race relations, and the like. That odd phrase, race relations. And then he writes Giovanni's Room, a novel about same-sex love. But it's not about same-sex love. It's about love,
right, between
people, two men, right? And he dares to, and then he says, I had to write it because, I didn't want you to hold that over my head. I told you, you didn't, it's just the beauty and brilliance and bravery and courage of this fragile queer Black man is just amazing. But I tend to gravitate to the nonfiction because I guess that's my sensibility.
Did he become disillusioned?
Oh yeah.
How would you describe that journey? And how would you describe your own journey right now? Are you disillusioned? Answer his first.
Yeah. They killed King. They assassinated him, the apostle of love. He's not naive about human beings, but what does it say about white America that they would kill him? And he collapsed, went to pieces. Tried to commit suicide in '69.
Baldwin.
Yeah. Had to go elsewhere. Wound up in Istanbul for a while to try to figure out how to begin again. He saw the country. He saw the hard hat revolution. He saw, the vitriol of the protest against busing. He saw what Nixon was doing and how he laid the foundation for Reagan and the betrayal of Carter in between. So his we changed, and this is an important point. In the early Baldwin, he says, right, the problem is not us. The Negro problem isn't about Black people, it's about white people. But Black folk have to love in order to help white people come to see themselves differently. But by the end of his life, he gave up on that notion. My task, and this is how I translate it, my task is not to convince the Trump voter to not hold insidious commitments. I'm tired of being preoccupied with the Trump voter. My task instead is to try to build a world where those insidious commitments have no quarter to breathe. So Baldwin is like, white folk got to deal with white folk. They got to save themselves. But we still have to build a new Jerusalem. And then they will have to make a choice. Can we build a world where whiteness affords you no advantage at all? Right? And that's what we should spend our energy, it seems to me.
Can we build that world? Are you disillusioned that we can build that world?
Du Bois, the great scholar and author of The Souls of Black Folk, said in his elegy about his son, he has a hope that's unhopeful, but not hopeless. A hope not hopeless, but unhopeful. That's the way he put it. A hope not hopeless, but unhopeful. It's a blues hope. So I have a hope that we can build a new world, a new Jerusalem. But, as B.B. King would say, nobody loves me but my mother, and she could be jiving too.
I love that you answer me with quotes. I want to be that guy someday, but I don't think anyone would believe it. Like when you do it, I'm like, yeah, of course. He's an academic. He's a scholar. He's a writer. If I did it, people would be like, what are you doing? Pete, what are you doing? Why are you answering with quotes? That's not even. And then I think they'd probably be like, it's not even the quote, jackass. I got it wrong. But what do you think of, I feel like I've asked this question to every single Black person I talk to on the record, much less off the record. What is this moment that we're in? How do you describe it? Do you think your son's generation, my daughter's generation is different? Because the only thing, I see two things that give me a lot of hope. My 75-year-old father burning down racist friends over emails, just literally, I'm done. And his own transformation on the issue. And I see younger people out in the streets seeming to understand our history and the inequities of it. And I'm talking about white people and obviously an understanding and embracement of diversity overall. And then finally, the polling, and I don't know if you gave a shit about the polling, but public opinion polling on the idea of and the movement of Black Lives Matter and the change that we see today versus 3 years ago. It gives me, I don't want to say a lot of hope because I'm tenuous, especially after reading, getting into your book and getting into Baldwin's work. And you mentioned earlier Reconstruction, and you mentioned, the 50s and 60s. This is kind of the third iteration. It's another movement, another outrage. And where will it go? How do you feel about this time?
So around the poll data, there's a conundrum, a paradox in sociological literature, right? Since the 1960s, we've actually seen a decline in racist views. So in the middle of the 1960s, people were vehemently against interracial marriage, supported segregated schools. And we've seen a precipitous decline in those racist views, but there's not a relationship. There's a gap between the decline in racist opinion and the support of policies to remedy racial injustice. So you could be against racism and racial discrimination. You can say it, but you're against affirmative action as a remedy. You're against. So as we're seeing, poll data showing white America's embrace of Black Lives Matter, the critique of policing, we have to see what that data shows us about their support of policies to transform the nature of policing in the country, because the gap always exists. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say about the generation is that there's something different, because I think this generation, whether they're millennials or Gen Zers or Zoomers or however we want to describe it, is that they know the place is broken. They've come of age in moments of catastrophe. whether it's Hurricane Katrina, whether it's the Great Recession, whether it's mass school shootings, murders of police, murders by police of people in the street, Black Lives Matter, a global pandemic, economic devastation, credit card debt being surpassed by student loan debt. I mean, we can just go on and on and on. And, having to move back home, all this stuff is happening. So they've grown up in an age where I think they've drawn the conclusion that the whole thing is broken. But the Boogaloo Boys are not baby boomers.
These are white supremacist Boogaloo Boys. Yeah. Yeah, they're right.
Richard Spencer is not a baby boomer.
Right.
Dylan Roof is not a baby boomer. So at the very moment there's a judgment being made that something is broken, people are banking they're banking for progressive policies, and some are becoming autocratic and fascist, right? And reaching for authoritarian languages as they scapegoat. So there's no guarantee that this moment will generate the outcome. But I say this, wherever human beings are, we got a chance. We just got to step up and struggle. Begin Again is the new book, and I congratulate you on it and clearly the tremendous amount of work and hours and travel even that you put into following James Baldwin's life and path, and as well as being vulnerable enough to share yours. And I also just want to say you're simply one of my favorite people to listen to watch, and to read. I think your ability to speak with such passion and consistency and statistics and facts is unlike very many people of our generation. You're a very special person. I hope you realize how important your work is to so many people. Well, thank you, Pete. Thank you for everything you're doing, man. Appreciate you. Finally, I do want to ask you, though, I realized I was going to ask you this at the beginning, your school, Princeton University, where you'll be in conversation, by the way, with Cornel West, who I think you call a mentor. Looking forward to that conversation. Has just changed the name of its public policy school, one of the best in the nation, of course. They've gotten rid of the name Woodrow Wilson. You've been talking about this. You've been tweeting about this. How do you feel about that change? Well, between Princeton changing the name of its public policy school and the state of Mississippi taking down the flag, I think hell is frozen. You're going to pinch yourself. Yeah. What's going on? I think it's about time. It's a wonderful gesture. Princeton understands that the country has historically disregarded the effects of white supremacy and racism, and that the way in which Princeton celebrated Woodrow Wilson in some ways duplicated that disregard. And so I think the president of Princeton was very clear that who we take ourselves to be today and who we aspire to be is not in alignment with the values of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson will always be a central part of Princeton's history. Princeton would not be Princeton if it wasn't for him. But the values we uphold, right? The values that we embrace, the Princeton that is today isn't Woodrow Wilson's Princeton. Right. And that's what history is all about. The questions always change and our answers always change as we ask them, as we try to answer them. Dr. Glaude, thank you for being our professor today. It's a great honor to be in conversation with you. Thank you. Appreciate you, man. Yeah, Professor Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr. He is on Twitter at E.S. Glaude, G-L-A-U-D-E. Get his book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. Oh, great guy. I really enjoyed that conversation. I think, my last interview before I went away for a week. And my first interview when I got back, the first person I talked to was my good friend Eric Segall of Georgia State University. He tweets at eSpinSegall. He's a constitutional law professor. He's written 2 books. And as you hear in this conversation, he does not believe that the court is a court. He doesn't think that the judges are justices, but are politicians with agendas in robes. We had an interesting conversation, and we had a little fun trying to connect dots and conspiracies about Bill Barr and Jeffrey Epstein and why Bill Barr would ever want that job. Well, we don't know, but and I would look up everything you heard here, of course, but maybe I've been listening too much Sarah Kendzior and Andrea Chalupa at Gaslit Nation. I think they're great. They do a lot of dot connecting that I buy into quite a bit of, and interesting stuff about Jeff Epstein and his connection to Bill Barr through his dad. And I don't know, look into it and tell me what you think of it.
call me crazy. Anyway, we talked a little bit about that stuff and a lot about the court. Another great conversation with the always awesome Professor Eric Segall of Georgia State University. And here he is now, the legal eagle, Eric Segall, the first guest I'm taping with since I'm back from my vacation. No better way to ease my way back into the conversation than with one of my bestest and smartest friends to talk about the entire, really, Supreme Court term. Well, the winners and losers. We've got to recap last weekend and the rest of it, really, if possible. I appreciate you joining me. Hi.
My pleasure. I hope you had fun in Nantucket. Sounds fun.
It was. It took me half the week to figure out how to relax, and then it was time to go.
I know that feeling, Pete. I do.
Yeah, I want to talk all about vacations and have conversations with people about how to have a relaxing vacation. But it seems like in the time of coronavirus, you're lucky to get away. And
not a good time for that discussion, I don't think.
Right. You sound pretty lucky, pretty privileged, I suppose.
Maybe a little bit. Although I have to say, I drove 7 hours yesterday from Atlanta to North Carolina and back, and there seemed to be a lot of people on vacation. So I don't know. Yeah. Well,
it's interesting in different parts of the country and how people are behaving. But there's so much to talk about. But let's get to the court and let's get to the news, because I definitely want to ask you first and foremost about, the Roger Stone thing, as well as just the idea that President Trump and his attorney general have removed the top 3 prosecutors investigating Trump in the D.C., New York, and Southern and Eastern district courts. All of those prosecutors were looking into Trump crimes. We don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but do you have any reactions to this, what I think is pretty much the biggest, kind of more longer unfolding story?
Yeah, well, I think it's of a piece with the Roger Stone news, where, of course, Trump commuted the sentence of this heinous, racist, lying, convicted felon who was prosecuted for covering up for Trump. So both of those news events, the Roger Stone and the shuffling around of the U.S. attorneys in the New York area, what they suggest to me is that, and you're not going to like this, is that Trump really doesn't plan on winning re-election. He plans on staying in office some other way. And you hate my conspiracy theories. I've only had one before. I've only had one conspiracy theory ever. I won't mention it. But I do think that Trump's people and Trump are planning a contingency where he doesn't have to face the American people. Because if he had to face the American people, it's hard to believe he'd be doing this and a bunch of other things involving the virus. Coming out and saying we have to go back, Pete, I know you didn't ask about this, but it's related.
Go ahead.
Saying schools have to open. Do you know how many parents that scares? Even some Republican parents. Like that's a very scary thing to a lot of people. He doesn't care. So my current working theory, which is kind of like a conspiracy theory, is I think he's going to use the virus as a national emergency to delay the election. I have no doubt Bill Barr would go along with that, but he wouldn't be able to do that if there were prosecutors in New York who at that moment in time had enough information to really charge he or his family with serious crimes. So I think they had to get rid of those people, not because of the election, but because, I mean, it wouldn't affect his base anyway, right? We know that. But I think it's all of a piece. I don't think these are all random events. Now, when I said this to smart friends of mine, they've said, you might be right. It's more likely they are just random events that Trump's an idiot and he tweets this and he tweets that. And
right.
There's no plan. The problem is that's certainly probable, except for one part of it. Yes, Trump is an idiot. Bill Barr is not. In fact, he's a really smart man. You know how much I hate Bill Barr, but I can't deny that he's a really smart man.
Well, if he's so smart, why would he walk into the shit show that is the Trump administration? Why would he go back to that job? Why would he want all of the headaches and potential criminal, guilt right. that could come with it?
Fair question. So now this is not mine, but I read a conspiracy theory that he's involved with Epstein and that woman, and this was his way of controlling that, Jeffrey Epstein.
There's more than nothing to that, okay. Because Epstein's Bill Barr's father hired Epstein.
I did not know that. I did not know that.
He hired
Wow.
Epstein to work at the Dalton School.
That's interesting.
Everybody look this up, but I'm pretty sure that's my understanding is that. And Sarah Kendzior talks about this. And yeah, it's
okay. So I'm about to say something that's going to get me just in the biggest trouble. But
well,
you know
we're
what?
just shooting the shit. It's just a podcast.
Yeah. I mean, and I'm used to, and I'm used to getting myself an incredible.
As long as you don't say that you believe that there's a global pedophile ring that you can order children on Wayfair, then I think we'll be all right.
I'm not saying
that's where the window is.
Well, I was going to say something around that subject, which is, from my understanding, Bill Barr is one of those people who believes in the end times and thinks, the good people are going up and the bad people are going down. That I don't know. What I do know for 100%.
I thought you said he was really smart.
There are a lot. Leonard Leal definitely believes. I mean, there are a lot of really smart people who believe that. I know that sounds crazy to you, but let me finish on this. Well, here's what we do know. We do know for a fact, because we can look it up, that Bill Barr went to Notre Dame University, one of the great universities in the world, about a month or so after he became Attorney General of the United States, and said, and I quote, "There is no morality or ethics separate from religion." He said that, and he said it many times.
And why is that such a controversial thing to say?
Because my view is, first of all, it's a heinous view, of course, but leaving that aside, this is what's going to get me in trouble. People who are that public with their piety, or piety, how do you pronounce that?
Yeah.
Who are pious, who are pious peers in public. I don't know. People who are that pious and that arrogant are usually the people who have horrific sexual scandals behind them. So, but leaving all that aside, here's what we do know. We know that Barr has rearranged and reshuffled and made sure that the anti-Trump or allegedly anti-Trump prosecutors in the New York area are out of a job or been moved someplace else. And why would he do that is an interesting question. And why would he work for Trump is an interesting question.
Right.
And I really don't know, other than it can't be because he respects Trump. I do not believe that's possible. In other words, I really don't. I don't think Bill Barr thinks to himself, "Wow, what a great guy Donald Trump is." That would shock me to the core. Is it a grab for power? Maybe, but he was the Attorney General before, and then he was an incredibly high-paid lawyer. And by the way, his reputation got repaired over the years.
Right.
So when as you and I have talked before, he helped convince George Bush, the first George Bush, to pardon Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, who was about to go on criminal trial like in a week, and 4 or 5 other people. And when he did that, and when Bush did that, there was some pushback. But over the years, Barr's reputation was, hey, you know what? Solid guy, great lawyer, hire him, he'll do your job. And now that's soiled, probably forever, right? So why would he do that? I don't know.
Yeah, those are important questions, and I hope someday we'll have answers to those. I don't know whether or not we will, but it was interesting when who did he answer that question about how will history see you? And he said, Bill Barr in an interview, history is, written by the winner. So that all depends on who wins.
He strikes. So one more thing that's going to get me in enormous trouble. I'm just in that kind of mood tonight. So there is a subset of lawyers. This is going to get me in so much trouble. There is a subset of lawyers. I'm going to describe them to you. I've been teaching law for 29 years. Before that, I practiced law for like 15 or 20. I'm old, and I've been a lawyer for a very long time. There are a subset of people who were very, very unpopular in high school for whatever reason. And then they went to college, and they were still very, very, very unpopular. I knew like 10 of these people at my law school in 1980. And then they get to law school, and they get great grades. And in most of America's elite law schools, getting great grades immediately catapults you into a different kind of popularity and place that you've ever been before in your life. And then you become a dick for the rest of your life. and that's Bill Barr. I would almost guarantee it.
Well, that is quite a generalization. One I
yes.
thoroughly enjoyed, and one that will get no pushback from this guy. That's good stuff. All right, you wrote a piece.
By the way, I was popular in high school, but not as much in law school. Go ahead.
You wrote a piece at Dorfonlaw, dorfonlaw.org, titled "The Court's Term: Who Won and Who Lost." I've talked to you more this month for the show than I ever have before, but we usually talk a lot in June because of all the Supreme Court decisions that come down. But this is a great comprehensive piece about the winners and the losers, and I hope everybody reads it. I wanted to ask you a few questions about it, but specifically because we hadn't talked about it, I wanted to get your take on the case that Oklahoma's Native Americans won. Tribal folks do not win very often anything in this country. They've had everything taken from them, and that continues to be the case in terms of the longstanding battle between the federal government and tribal communities and reservations. What do we need to know? What happened here? How big of a deal is this case?
Yeah, this is an under-talked about case, but not for the reasons you might think. So a couple things. So there was a guy who allegedly committed just the most heinous crimes. I think he was accused of raping a 4-year-old. I mean, terrible person. And Oklahoma,
McGirt v. Oklahoma, if anybody wants to look it up.
McGirt would be the guy. And Oklahoma tried him, and he was sentenced to prison, I think, for 1,000 years. That's how bad it got. He was sentenced to prison for 1,000 years.
That's a long sentence.
That's a long
Hey, how many more years you got there? 982.
I mean, and we shouldn't joke because he's really a horrific guy who did horrific things, allegedly. But anyway, the issue in the case was he said that where he's Native American and where he committed the crime was on Native American land. And Oklahoma said, and therefore you can't try me. Only my tribe can try me. Maybe the federal government can try me, but you, the state of Oklahoma, cannot try me for this, what we call major crimes. Doesn't apply to misdemeanors, but major crimes. Anyway, this case, and basically what he was saying was almost all of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and then a bunch of other land isn't really owned by Oklahoma. It's owned by Native Americans. And of course, that's a huge deal, obviously. Native Americans always lose in the Supreme Court. I just want to do a brief story. I teach a lot of Native American cases or cases involving Native Americans. And many years ago, I taught one of the cases that was actually a case about when the government can be sued or not. Mm-hmm. And Native Americans happened to be the plaintiffs, but it wasn't about them really. And at the end of my discussion, I said to the class, what's the biggest holding of this case? And a student raised his hand and said, Native Americans always lose, which is a fair statement. So this case came up like 4 years ago. And this is when Scalia died and Gorsuch wasn't yet on the court. And there were 8 justices split among liberals and conservatives. And it was 4-4 because it was a tie. So they didn't decide anything. So it came back now after Gorsuch, after they have a full complement. Now, here's now before we get to the Native American stuff, let me say this. The law governing this issue, who really owns Tulsa, Oklahoma? Is it Oklahoma or is it Native Americans?
Right.
Is about the most complicated Supreme Court decision I've ever read.
Oh, really?
It involves treaties and promises and unclear law. And frankly, I don't know any constitutional law professor. I don't know a single constitutional law professor who's qualified to talk about who's right, who's wrong in this case.
Well,
not a single one. Let me finish.
Okay.
Hold on. I want to make a point.
Sure.
Sorry. So I cannot tell you who's right, who's wrong. I can't do that. As far as who won, yes, he won, but he can still be tried for these crimes, both if Native Americans win, I mean, all they won so far is if you commit an atrocious crime in this part of Oklahoma, Oklahoma can't put you in jail. Someone else has to put you in jail. Now, that may be a victory or not. They may later argue that they have other claims to this land other than not being tried for major crimes. How that's going to play out, I can't tell you. I'm not an expert on this. And I don't know a single person who's an expert on this. But this is what I want to say, Pete. The first time this case came up, 4 liberals voted for Native Americans because they were the underdogs. 4 conservatives voted for Oklahoma because they're always for the status quo, or mostly for the status quo. None of them care about the law at issue in this case. Ironically, Justice Scalia, when he was alive and dissenting in the Obergefell same-sex marriage case, was talking about how the Supreme Court was not diverse and was just 9 lawyers from the East Coast with no true Westerner. That's what he said. That's a direct quote. He said there's no true Westerner on this court. Justice Kennedy, who was there, was from Sacramento. Scalia said California doesn't count as being in the West. That's what Scalia said before he died. Gorsuch replaces Scalia. Gorsuch fancies himself a true Westerner. I've read his autobiography. If you read it, he's proud of his hats, he's proud of his horses, and he's proud of his ranch. Now, the reality is that he grew up in Washington, D.C., went to the same private school as Brett Kavanaugh, and his mother was the director of the EPA before she had to resign in shame. But leaving that aside,
Yeah.
He fancies himself a true Westerner. And we also knew, before we came to the Supreme Court, that he has been very sympathetic, mostly, I think, in dissent, to Native American claims.
Right.
So what decided this case, divided 4-4 liberals, conservatives, was Justice Gorsuch's prior value judgments about Native Americans. Nothing to do with the law. So it fits very well with what you and I have been talking about for 10 years now, which is, in this case, what decided this case, the 4 liberals went for the underdog, the 4 conservatives, other conservatives, and Gorsuch went for the status quo, and Gorsuch would normally go for the status quo, except he fancies himself a cowboy who's friendly to Indians. I'm sorry, Native Americans. And if you read his book, you'll see that. So that, I think, is important in the context of the whole term. As far as who won, who lost this case, this guy who allegedly raped a child or something, he's still going to jail at some point. Don't worry about it. But it's a complicated case involving Oklahoma's land and the relationship between Oklahoma and Native Americans. And I don't know any law professor who knows more about it than that.
The primary impact of the case is that Oklahoma loses a lot of its power to enforce certain laws against members of Native American tribes within the borders of their tribal lands.
Yes, but major crimes, yes.
Yeah. I think the reason why this case is not getting a lot of attention is because it doesn't have that much of an impact on non-Native Americans.
That's one reason. Another reason, and because no law professor can talk about it intelligently.
Okay, well, that's an interesting point as well. Well, it brings us...
I'm serious. I don't know a single con law professor who knows about this area of the law. I don't. Yeah.
Well, that says something because you know a lot of con law professors, and they all know you. We're talking to Eric Segall at eSpinSiegel on Twitter. I break in the conversations now to replug my guests. It's like a commercial without a commercial. All right, Eric. So there are cases that do affect a lot more people and are always big deal when they make it to the Supreme Court. And of course, there was a guns case and an abortion case, and it's surprising outcomes on both those, an LGBT case as well, but it would seem that liberals won a lot of cases before a conservative Supreme Court, or they won more than we thought that we would.
Well, let's talk about that.
Okay.
So I think there are 3 big liberal victories that people generally care about. The first one, of course, is the Supreme Court ruling that gays, lesbians, and transgender people get the full protection of our country's employment discrimination laws, at least when they're not working for a religious organization. And that could have gone either way, but it went 6-3 with Gorsuch and Roberts both writing. And Gorsuch wrote the opinion, which is interesting, and it was viewed by some as an example of Gorsuch's sincerity on what he calls textualism. And he went through a really long, detailed analysis of the language of the relevant federal statute, Title VII. And he kept using words like, I'm going by the text, I'm going by the clear language, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And it's a huge, no matter what I'm going to say about it, it's a huge victory for gays, lesbians, and transgender people. And I'm really glad it happened, and they deserve it, and it's going to change how many employers operate, and it's absolutely a victory for liberals. Now, it turns out that somewhere around 70% of Americans favor equal rights at the workplace for gays and lesbians.
Right.
And so that I know that's what polls show. My guess is if you look at just white elite males over 50, which is what Gorsuch is, that number would be 60%. I mean, it would be 80%. It would be very high. So what the Supreme Court did in this case is what the American people overwhelmingly wanted it to do. Doesn't mean I'm not saying a bad thing or a good thing. I'm just observing.
Right.
Justice Roberts went along with it, I think mostly probably because he was going to lose anyway. So why not? I mean, why not? It's a huge victory for gays and lesbians. So there's nothing else I can say about that. It's a huge, wonderful victory for gays and lesbians. It is not a victory for textualism, because if you read the dissents, which there were several of them, and they were very heated, they will, if you read Gorsuch's opinion and then you read their opinion and then you look at the law, you'd say, it's a close call. I don't know what the answer is. The truth is, what the law said was illegal was discrimination based on sex. That's the exact language. You discriminate against because of your sex. When those words were written, no one thought it meant gays and lesbians could sue for that. Nobody thought that.
They didn't. They thought a word meant gender, not sexual orientation.
Exactly. My friend, Judge Posner.
We almost made it through without a reference to Posner. What do we have, folks, for you today?
Wrote a Court of Appeals opinion where he said, our job is to take that language, as judges, our job is to take that language and apply it to today's values. And when he did that, he said most people today would consider this discrimination based on sexual orientation. Right. Because, we've discussed that before. What Gorsuch said was, I can just read the statute and decide it covers sexual orientation discrimination. And that's not true. And the dissent said, we can read the statute and say it doesn't cover sexual orientation discrimination. And that's not true. It's ambiguous. Life is full of ambiguity. This is one of those things where the language was ambiguous. So when Justice Gorsuch rules in a way that I like, which he did for gays and lesbians, it's not because of the language. It's because he wanted to rule for gays and lesbians. Because anybody smart who reads both opinions, the majority and dissent, will say, close call. Anyway, gays and lesbians and transgender people won, and that's really good, which makes the other big winner ironic, because the other big winner was religion generally, and religious schools specifically, religious schools many of which do not hire gays and lesbians. And Gorsuch dropped a paragraph in the gay and lesbian case saying this case may not apply to religion. In other words, if the objection is, I don't like it because you're gay, you can't do that in America anymore. But if the objection is, my religion doesn't let me hire you, well, then Gorsuch has a paragraph that says, we're not resolving that here. You see the irony, right?
Well, yeah, because it means it doesn't let me hire you, but I can't fire you if I did.
No, same thing.
I have to fire you. My religion does not allow me to employ somebody with your perverted sexual natures.
Exactly.
Meanwhile, my internet history is littered with scary, scary perversions.
2 huge religion cases. Yeah. Both of which are epic disasters for America and just awful cases. One involved, let's get serious for a moment, because this is actually kind of serious. So a woman teaches at a Catholic school, and she's not a priest. So I'm going to say right now, the federal government or Congress, there can be we can't tell churches which priests to hire. We can't tell temples which rabbis to hire. If they don't want to hire gay rabbis, they don't have to. The law can't. Freedom of religion means every religion gets to pick its leaders, no matter what Congress says. And I agree with that. Okay? This wasn't that. This was a religious school teacher who did sometimes pray with her students, but who also taught secular courses and things, and she got breast cancer. And she went to her school and said, I'm going to take some time off from my breast cancer, and I'd like to come back when I'm done. And there's a federal law about this, about anti-disability, that might have applied to the situation. But the school said, nope, sorry, you're fired. Don't come back. There was another plaintiff who claimed that she was fired because of her age. And there's an anti-age discrimination law. So Congress has passed a lot of laws protecting American workers. Sometimes you can't fire someone because of their race, because of their national origin, because of their sexual orientation or their gender, or there are also laws about disability and age. They're more complicated laws. The Supreme Court held that these two plaintiffs, the woman with breast cancer is now dead, but these two plaintiffs could not sue their schools because of something the Supreme Court calls the ministerial exception, except it doesn't apply to ministers. It applies to ministers and a lot of other people. And what it basically means is religious schools can hire and fire virtually anybody for any reason, and there's nothing Congress can do about it.
I feel like we did not talk about this case.
No, we haven't yet. And this is putting religion above the law, period. So you have a secular, and this gets important for the next case. You have a small town, and you have a Catholic school, and you have a secular private school, non-religious private school. And they have two women with breast cancer, and one gets the protection of federal law. That's the one in the secular school. The one in the religious school gets no protection from federal law. Is that religious equality, or is that religious superiority? And we both know what it is. It's religious superiority.
Oh, now, I wasn't sure if I was supposed to answer that.
Sorry. The court's rationale for this is we can't really get involved in the religious matters of religious schools and churches and temples. We all agree with that general proposition.
Yeah, I would say so.
But not here, because these people weren't fired because they didn't follow the faith or they didn't teach the Bible.
They were fired because they got a disease.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
Well,
and now it gets worse, because the second case, which is even worse than this case, much worse, the second case hits me close to home. So can I tell a little story about this?
Sure.
We get into, okay. But I think you know this. When I worked for the Department of Justice for 4 years, I worked on a very large case involving a federal program that gives billions of dollars to schools all over the country. Most of that money goes to public schools, but some of that money also goes to private secular schools and private religious schools. At the time, the Supreme Court had put restrictions under the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, on what aid government could give to private religious schools, because the Supreme Court thought that was using taxpayer money to support religion.
Yeah.
And if there's anything that Madison and Jefferson agreed about, it was taxpayer money should not be given to support religion against the will of the taxpayer. So my job was to defend these federal programs that helped. And the case I had was in San Francisco involving Catholic schools. And anyway, I defended the program, and we eventually won. And eventually the court, when Justice Thomas replaced Justice Marshall in 91, changed the law on that to what I think is the right result. I think this is the right result. What the Supreme Court eventually said was, if you give secular, non-religious assistance to private, non-religious schools, you states, Georgia, New York, are allowed to give the same materials to religious schools. You don't have to, but you're allowed to. I was involved in cases where the argument was they weren't allowed to do it at all. You understand? So my view was, and the Supreme Court agreed eventually, nothing in the Constitution stops New York from saying we're going to help private secular schools and we're going to help private religious schools in the same way, in an equal way. Now, we can't pay for Bibles or Torahs, and we can't pay the salaries of the rabbis, but we're talking about math books and computers and things that can't be diverted to, things that aren't inherently religious. So that was the law. And Pete, I worked, I'm going to get emotional here, for 4 years, hand in hand with the lawyer for the United States Catholic Conference. And he was a former Supreme Court clerk, and he was the most pro-Catholic litigator I'd ever met. His client was the United States Catholic Conference. No one in 1990, no one ever made the argument that states have to give religious schools the same assistance they give non-religious schools. No one ever made that argument. No one thought that. It was an obscene, absurd, ridiculous thought. All they thought was New York has the right to do it, not that New York has to do it. And this term, the Supreme Court held that if Montana, that was the case at issue, but it applies to all 50 states. If Montana wants to give aid to private secular schools, it must give the same aid to private religious schools, whether it wants to or not. And Montana's argument was, listen, we have two different constitutional provisions here. The Establishment Clause is about not rewarding religion too much. The Free Exercise Clause is about not punishing religion. So everybody in the world agrees you can't be put in jail because of your religion.
Right.
You can't be taxed more because of your religion. But states have a problem in that they don't want to give too much to religion, but they can't punish religion. And where the Supreme Court ended up in 1993 or 4, I think it was okay, you decide. If you want to give religious schools money, fine. If you don't want to, that's fine too. It's up to you. Now they don't have that choice anymore. And Pete, there are 37 states that have state constitutional provisions that say no taxpayer money can go to religious institutions. And the Supreme Court just basically, in effect, invalidated 37 state
Wow,
laws.
it's such an important case for so many reasons. But just general people, Americans' values and public opinion on religion and teaching religion, and the idea that we all have different opinions on where our taxes should go. I mean, that's a set of morals or values, but the idea, for many of us who are not religious, or in my case, even anti-religious, is you can practice whatever religion you want, but don't make my taxpayer money have to go to teaching it to kids. And that's no longer necessarily going to be the case.
Right.
So,
and Justice Brennan once said, if New York, you live in New York, if New York uses your tax money in a way you don't like, or if the federal government uses your tax dollars to fight a war in Iraq, which you don't like, you can't sue over that. You just can't. There's no lawsuit about that. Right. You can't. And Justice Brennan said there may in fact be no limit on what the government can do with your tax dollars, except for one. They can't use your tax dollars to support a church.
Not anymore.
Because Jefferson and Madison said that. And yes, not anymore.
Well, I don't know how much more time you have. I could talk to you forever. I mean, this piece
I'd like to talk about Justice Roberts for a minute.
Yeah, you wrap your piece up by basically saying it's his court now, and that's not good for liberals. Don't get too excited.
I did not exactly.
I misinterpreted.
Just by a hair.
Go ahead.
Just by a hair. Okay. I mean, certainly it's better that Roberts is the Chief Justice and someone like Justice Thomas or Justice Alito, which would require leaving the country for 20 years. So don't.
Didn't Justice Thomas's wife? What's the story with her? She's a real way out there, and didn't she just?
She hated Obama more than any person, I think, anywhere.
She criticized Black Lives Matter movement. I think is that what I read?
She used to lobby against the Affordable Care Act. She was paid to lobby against the Affordable Care Act. And she's a huge Trump supporter, and it's just really ugly.
What did you want to say about Roberts? Sorry.
What I want to say about him is as usual, I'm alone in this view of the Supreme Court this term. I think it is absolutely true that this was it's just true. This was a more liberal term than expected. Now, there were some conservative victories we're not talking about in some other cases, and the Trump tax return cases were a tie. So we didn't talk, an effective tie. But here's the thing. I think Roberts did a good job this term of doing something that Justice O'Connor used to do all the time, which is try to find the middle ground of the American people and make a decision that some people are going to like, some people are going to hate, but most people are going to say, that's okay. It's within the parameters of reasonable, like left center, right center politics. And Roberts, we didn't talk about the abortion case where Roberts did side with the liberals, but in a legal way where my friend Mike Dorff, who's been on this podcast, thinks is going to hurt abortion in the future. So some of these liberal victories today might be liberal losses next term because Justice Roberts plays the long game. He did it with the Voting Rights Act. He's very good at it. But here's the only point I want to make. Justice O'Connor, everybody agrees, spent her career trying to find kind of the middle ground. And I think Roberts this term tried to find the middle ground. And he's incredibly powerful, much more powerful than Kennedy was, because he's the Chief Justice. So the rule at the Supreme Court is if the Chief Justice is in the majority, he gets to assign the opinion. Who writes the opinion? If he's not in the majority, then the next most senior justice gets to assign the opinion. Chief Justice Roberts was in the majority in every case this term but 2. That's an amazing record. He only dissented twice, Pete, all year, which means he assigned every opinion except 2. Now,
I don't know what that means, but
no. So they vote. And let's say it's 5-4. Okay, if Justice Roberts is one of the 5, he gets to decide who writes the opinion, who writes the first draft of the opinion. That's incredibly who's the author of the opinion. That's incredibly important because for strategic reasons and other reasons. When Justice Kennedy and Justice Roberts, it used to be the Kennedy court. Kennedy was the swing vote. But if they were both in the majority, Roberts got to write the opinion or decide who writes the opinion. Now, Roberts is both the swing vote and the Chief Justice. That hasn't happened since 1936.
I see what you're saying. This is a longstanding part of the conversation about the Supreme Court locus of power.
Yes. Now, I just want to say, I'll wrap up really quickly. So I think Roberts did move to the center. I think he's trying to find a place for himself.
He gutted the Voting Rights Act in Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act in 2010. And I just have to mention it. Anytime we're making him sound, decent.
He also Citizens United. There's a lot
of terrible decisions.
But that's not even the point. Here's the point I want to make. It wasn't about law.
Right.
And it's never been about law for Justice Roberts.
It's about politics. It's about the
well, no, in this case I think it's about his personal reputation and the Supreme Court's long-term reputation. Because he wants both. I sincerely believes he cares about the Supreme Court a lot. Don't get me wrong. And I think he cares. That's how people explain his vote in the Affordable Care Act case. I think it may be right. He cares both about the institutional legacy of the Supreme Court and his own personal legacy. And that's fine. But don't tell me it's about the law, because it's not.
Right.
And so his votes this term were about his legacy and the court's legacy. And that's fine. But let's just call it for what it is.
You should read, everybody, the comprehensive piece by Siegel at Dorf on Law, The Court's Term, Who Won and Who Lost. He only said one thing about Trump's taxes decisions. But I'm not sure that there's much more to say. People probably have heard a lot about it at this point. But if you haven't, what is the legal thing?
So I think that there is something that future presidents now have to worry about state prosecutors investigating them. That was one of the cases. And they might have to worry about Congress investigating them.
Well, if they don't pay hush money to porn stars, maybe it won't be that big of a concern.
But none of that matters for this election because the court punted that very self-consciously so that nothing can happen before November. More importantly, though, it's still unclear, Pete, if a president can be indicted while in office, and he probably can't be. So, these investigations will end when most of the time, when unpopular presidents leave. The fact that the court held that Cyrus Vance Jr., the New York district attorney, can go to a grand jury.
Who I've smoked cigars with at a private home announcement.
Yes, you told me that, I remember.
I don't mean to drop names, but John Meacham was there. Anyway, go ahead.
No. I like John Meacham. Newsweek. He was a great Newsweek writer.
Great historian. Great guy. He had the cigars. Anyway, me and Meacham and Vance. Go ahead.
So we didn't know we didn't know before this term if a state prosecutor could do that. Now we know that he can, and that's not nothing. That's not nothing. But is that going to affect anybody's life at any time over the next few years? No.
Right, and that's how I've always generally looked at these cases in terms of talking about them here on the show. Or issues in general, like who gets impacted by them, how many people are impacted by them, and how serious. What is the precedent that they set for us now and our kids in the future? Obviously,
and I think it was good you kept those 2 cases for last because although they were maybe the most
sexy and anticipated,
a complete. It's not going to matter much in the future. It's my opinion. I could be wrong, but I don't think it's going to matter much. At the end of the day, the most important thing for next term and the next term until the court changes is Justice Roberts is unconscionably powerful. And we shouldn't live in a country where an unelected, life-tenured lawyer, one, can decide issues of abortion, gay rights, affirmative action, gun control. By the way, the biggest loser this term was the Second Amendment, thank God. The court had one Second Amendment case. It punted it correctly because the case didn't matter. It was moot, didn't matter anymore.
Right.
And there were about 20 cases they could have heard, and they said no to every single one. So the big loser, for the first time I've ever said the sentence on your show, the big loser this term was the Second Amendment and the Establishment Clause. Those were the two biggest losers.
All right. Well, I think we'll end it there on that note. A lot of good notes today. We did a little of our own conspiracy at the top, which is fun and interesting. And the whole Bill Barr thing. Yeah. Fascinating.
Yes, we're going to be talking about that a lot more, I think, as time goes on.
Such a weird thing that he would want that job.
Well, he's so weird. He is such a weird guy.
just that he would want that job, Eric.
I agree. Who'd want to be Trump's attorney general?
You could almost say it's the attorney general. But in his case, he's already had that job. He already did it.
Well,
he already did it. There's nothing. It's not like a Supreme Court. I don't know what's above attorney general of the United States of America. But I mean, why would he want to be Trump's attorney general?
For a lawyer, the only job more important than the attorney general is Supreme Court justice. Did
you see the Robert Mueller op-ed in the Washington Post?
I thought it was really well written, and I was wondering why he hasn't done more of that.
Yeah, about Roger Stone, and people haven't seen it. And he's like, Roger Stone's a fucking criminal. What are you doing? I mean, he was found
I didn't know.
guilty by a trial of his peer, a jury of his peers. He was found guilty.
Speaking of Roger Stone, I saw the pictures. So unless the pictures were doctored, Roger Stone and who's the guy who was involved with Ukraine, who was Trump's campaign manager, Manafort. Roger Stone, Paul Manafort, and a third one who's involved in all that. We're all together in 1981 working for Reagan.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I didn't know that.
They had a firm. They started together. It was called Manafort Stone, and I think there were two other partners in it.
Well, and there's a third person who's involved in all this now. Oh, maybe it's I forget who it is.
Well,
but in any event,
what's the point? You didn't know about that? You didn't know that the two of them had been working for the governments of the worst barbaric leaders in the country.
In the world.
I mean, they took money from anyone to help them win elections anywhere in the world, and they did it in the most unethical.
I didn't realize they went
ways.
that far back. I didn't realize they went that far.
Oh, yeah, they've been
back.
Yeah. But why is that? You're just pointing that out, the connection, or?
Well, I think I'm so depressed about how the Mueller investigation has been lied about by Bill Barr.
Yeah, and just repeating, and by everybody in the media. But I mean, the bottom line with that, I think I have it right. I mean, basically is it was a game of telephone. You know, Trump has always been good not to be on tape necessarily saying certain types of things, although he is at times. And often he's just out in the open, obviously being corrupt, like the commutation of Stone. I mean, that's just out in the open corruption, the kind of stuff we see with third world autocrats, an American president community in the sense of a person convicted by a jury of lying to shield that president, him.
And then it gets,
But I just think it's important that the Mueller investigation and the Russian interference, the Russians hacked emails. They gave them to Julian Assange. Julian Assange talks to Stone. Stone talks to his pal Manafort and his pal Trump. They know what's coming.
Yep. That's what happened. Like, that's what happened.
Yeah, I mean,
and
listen.
Then Bill Barr comes in and totally distorts the Mueller report in every imaginable way.
Yeah.
But there's one more piece of that puzzle.
So much for Bill Barr and Mueller's friendship.
It's not just Manafort and Stone, as someone named Sarah Posner just wrote in a book called Unholy.
Oh, yeah. I interviewed her because you mentioned her on this podcast. She was on the show.
I'm glad. Evangelical leaders have been taking the sides of these right-wing totalitarian leaders since 2010, 2011. And Manafort and Stone are involved in all those people too. So it's all full circle. and and the evangelicals now run the executive branch, as I'm sure she told you. So why? I don't think Bill Barr is an evangelical, but he is a religious nut. Pardon me.
Well, so is Mike Pompeo.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
So I recommend to everyone listening to this, if they can stomach it, Lynn and I could not, to watch a documentary called The Family.
Yeah. I interviewed Sarah Posner on episode 134. And
Excellent.
then after that, I think 2 episodes later, I interviewed and had a really great conversation with Jeff Charlotte, who wrote the book that Netflix series is based on, The Family.
Yes, he follows me on Twitter now. Yes,
yeah, he's great.
Yes,
We really hit it off. He's a great guy, and his investigative journalism is outstanding. And Sarah Posner's book is also outstanding. Yeah.
Yes, and if your listeners want to be scared but more knowledgeable, the documentary The Family will do that for you, and it is very frightening.
If you're not scared right now, who are you?
Maybe you're Bill Barr.
Ha!
I don't know.
Jeff Charlotte, by the way, episode 136, in case anybody wants to go listen to those.
I'm so glad you interviewed her. She and I know each other. She was my first podcast. She invited me to her podcast 12 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And she had one.
And she did then. She doesn't anymore, I don't think.
Wow.
And she's a serious author who wrote a serious book called Unholy.
Well, you know it's a great book. And you know who does have a podcast is you. What's the deal? What's the update?
So that's interesting. So do you want to go on a little longer? I've done 2 episodes. The first one was a very constitutional law podcast with a Yale law professor who's one of the most famous con law professors in the country, Jack Balkin. I did a second one with a friend of mine who's a law professor in Colorado named Nancy Leong, who is having a book come out, which you're going to read and you're going to love, and you're going to have her on your podcast.
Great.
Called Identity Capitalism. And it is how we all make money from our identities, and how especially white males make money, and how universities put black people on the cover of their glossy magazines, even though those black people never went to those colleges. And that's my second one. I'm doing a third one, get this, with Jonathan Adler this Tuesday. My nemesis. Yes, my common law nemesis.
That's going to be good.
So we're going to debate the court's term, and that's going to be interesting.
Now,
and then I'm going to look at all 3 and decide if I really want to do this for a thing, because I don't know if I'm very good at it. And if I like it, I'll keep doing it. And if I don't like it, this will be the last one. I've gotten pretty positive feedback, mostly on my long hair, but on some other things.
That's funny.
And I don't know, Pete. The answer is I don't know what's going to happen.
Well, I hope you keep talking anywhere that invites you and anywhere that there's a microphone, because it's always great to get your interpretation and view on all these things, because you have a pretty radical view that more and more people have come to over the years that I've been talking to you, I feel. And most importantly, not most importantly, but I thought it was really funny that you opened your piece by saying it's good that we got to hear the court, albeit not live, but because of the pandemic, we got to hear the actual arguments right on audio. And you think we're 2 pandemics away from TV cameras in the courtroom?
Yeah, that's what I said. 2
more.
No, I said it took a global pandemic to get us to hear them live. To get them to see them live, we're probably 2 pandemics away.
Yeah, pandemic humor. Not easy to do. Well done, I say, sir. Well done.
Thank you, my friend.
All right, I'll talk to you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks,
right.
Pete.
Bye. Eric Segall. Sorry. At E-Spin Siegel on Twitter. Follow him there. Tell him thank you for joining Pete. As always, he's been on the show almost every week. I think he was every week in June, breaking down the Supreme Court's decisions. What a service for us here on the show. I mean, it's all his interpretation, his opinion. It all is when it comes to the law and the Constitution. But he's got something to say that's usually different. It's unpredictable, and he's so damn articulate. He's such a good talker. I love joining him in conversation about, anything. We talked for another, 15, 20 minutes about his kids going to camp and our vacation, and all about how we're both lucky but also scared. And anyway, it's always great talking to Eric Segall, and it's always great talking to you. So drop me a line. Let me know the answer to my question. Where does coronavirus end? How does it end? When does it end? Does it ever end? I would love to hear from you on that. Email me, standupwithpete petedominic@gmail.com. Send me your phone number, and I would love to talk to you and get your thoughts on that as well. Do you have any crazy conspiracy believing friends, relatives, neighbors? I also want to talk to those people and you about those people, because I've got deep concerns as to how these crazy theories are spreading like wildfire about global pedophile rings or whatever that the Democrats and the deep state are protecting, and all those QAnon theories. You know what I'm talking about. Okay, I'm out of time. I've got to post this baby. If you're not supporting me with a paid subscription, what are you waiting for? Stand Up with Pete Dominic is a daily podcast where I talk to the best, smartest, most interesting people I can find about the relevant issues, how to deal, how to understand, how to live in this crazy situation that we are in. If you live in Texas or Arizona or Florida, oh, my heart goes out to you. Stay safe in those states where the coronavirus is spiking, and we got to keep supporting each other. We got to help each other stay sane in these insane times. And I'm here for you. I know you're there for me. So join the Patreon community that we've built of over 630 subscribers if you haven't, and join us in conversation about all of the issues that we're all dealing with each and every day. That is patreon.com/Pete Dominic. I'll talk to you tomorrow. You're not alone. I'm right here with you. Drop me a line. Really, do it.